There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with effort. You sleep enough, you eat, you maintain the routines, yet something remains hollow. You move through your days executing tasks, fulfilling obligations, responding to expectations. And beneath it all runs a quiet, persistent question you have learned not to ask too loudly. Is this actually my life? Not in the superficial sense. Not whether you chose this career or this relationship or this city. The question runs deeper. It asks whether the person living this life is authentically you, or merely a carefully rehearsed performance of what you believed you were supposed to become. Carl Jung understood something that most people spend their entire existence avoiding. He understood that the majority of human beings never actually meet themselves. They encounter reflections, approximations, projections. They interact with the version of themselves that learn to survive, to be accepted, to avoid punishment and rejection. But the self beneath all that conditioning, beneath all those accumulated layers of adaptation and defense, that self remains unknown, untouched, unborn. Jung wrote that life begins when you find yourself. Not when you achieve something, not when you acquire something, not when others validate you. Life begins in the moment you stop living according to an inherited script and start living from the center of what you actually are. But most people never arrive at that moment. They die without ever truly beginning. Consider the architecture of your personality, the beliefs you hold about right and wrong, success and failure, worthiness and shame. How many of those beliefs did you consciously choose? How many did you examine, test, and deliberately integrate? Or did they simply appear in your psyche, installed by parents, culture, religion, education, trauma, forces that shaped you before you had the capacity to resist or question? You learned what behaviors were rewarded. You learned what expressions were punished. You learned which parts of yourself were acceptable and which parts needed to be hidden, suppressed, or denied entirely. And slowly, methodically, you constructed a personality designed not to express truth, but to ensure survival. This is what Jung called the persona, the mask, the social face you present to the world. It is necessary. Without it, you could not function in civilization. But the catastrophic error most people make is forgetting that it is a mask. They mistake the performance for reality. They believe the role they play is the totality of who they are. And so they live their entire lives as strangers to themselves. The formation of this mask begins early, long before you possess the language to describe what is happening to you. As a child, you existed in a state of relative wholeness. You expressed what you felt without filters, without concern for how it would be received. You cried when you hurt. You laughed when you delighted. You raged when you were frustrated. You were present, unmediated, raw. But that wholeness was not permitted to remain intact. The world demanded adjustment. Your caregivers, however well-intentioned, could not accept all of you. Some parts were praised. Some parts were tolerated. Some parts were met with disapproval, punishment, or the withdrawal of love. And because love was survival, because abandonment meant annihilation, you learned to divide yourself. You learned to show the acceptable parts and bury the rest. Not consciously, not deliberately, but with the animal intelligence of a creature adapting to its environment. The parts of you that were met with rejection did not disappear. They went underground. They became the shadow territory of your psyche, the forbidden zones you would spend the rest of your life pretending did not exist. The persona becomes a prison when you forget you created it. You begin to fear any impulse, any thought, any desire that contradicts the image you have worked so hard to maintain. You police yourself. You monitor your reactions. You curate your responses to ensure they align with the person you have convinced yourself you must be. But beneath that carefully controlled surface, something else is moving. Something older. Something truer. Something that refuses to be edited or erased. Jung called this the unconscious. Not the tidy, manageable unconscious of surface psychology, but a vast, autonomous realm that contains everything you have rejected, denied, and disowned. Your unfulfilled desires. Your forbidden impulses, your authentic needs, your unlived potential, all of it submerged, not destroyed, all of it waiting. The unconscious does not simply sit passively in the background. It influences you. It moves through you. It manifests in your dreams, your sudden moods, your inexplicable anxieties, your self-sabotaging behaviors. It speaks in symptoms. It communicates through the things you cannot explain about yourself. Why you keep repeating the same destructive patterns, why you feel empty despite having everything you thought you wanted, why you sometimes act in ways that contradict everything you claim to believe. These are not malfunctions. These are messages from the parts of yourself you abandoned. When you suppress a desire, it does not evaporate. It transforms. It becomes a compulsion, an addiction, a relationship pattern that repeats until you finally recognize what you are avoiding. When you deny an emotion, it does not dissolve. It embeds itself in your body, in your posture, in your chronic pain, in your inexplicable illnesses. When you reject the truth about yourself, it does not vanish. It returns through projection, through the people you inexplicably hate, through the judgments you cast on others that reveal what you cannot accept in yourself. The unconscious is not your enemy. It is the repository of everything you could not afford to be when you were learning how to survive. It is the archive of your authentic self, preserved in exile, waiting for the moment you become strong enough to reclaim it. To find yourself, in Jung's understanding, is not to discover some new identity. It is to recover what was always there. It is to reclaim the territory you surrendered in order to be loved, accepted, and safe. But reclamation requires confrontation. It requires you to face the uncomfortable truth that much of what you call your life has been constructed by forces you never consented to. Think about the desires you carry, the ambitions, the goals. Strip away the justifications, the rationalizations, the reasonable explanations. What remains? Are these desires truly yours? Or are they echoes of what someone else wanted for you, what culture promised would make you valuable, what fear convinced you was necessary? Most people pursue goals they do not actually want. They sacrifice years of their finite existence chasing achievements that mean nothing to their authentic self. They climb ladders leaning against the wrong walls. And when they finally reach the top, they experience not triumph, but a sickening recognition. This was never what I wanted. I have been living someone else's definition of success. But by then they have invested too much to turn back. The sunk cost of their misdirected life becomes an argument for continuing. So they continue. They double down. They convince themselves that the emptiness is normal, that everyone feels this way, that fulfillment was always a myth. They numb themselves with distractions, substances, compulsions. Anything to avoid the unbearable realization that they have spent their one existence performing a role written by strangers. Jung called this psychological death. You are alive, but you are not living. You are breathing, but you are not present. You have forfeited your existence to an invisible committee of voices, expectations, and judgments that were installed in your psyche before you could defend yourself. And the tragedy is that most people do not even realize this has happened. They attribute their emptiness to external circumstances. They believe that the next achievement, the next relationship, the next change of scenery will finally deliver the sense of aliveness they are seeking. But the void they are trying to fill is not a lack of something external. It is the absence of themselves. Finding yourself is not a comfortable process. It is not a weekend workshop. It is not a guided meditation or an affirmation practice. It is a dismantling, a dissolution of the false structures you built to protect yourself from rejection and annihilation. It requires you to question everything you thought you knew about who you are. This is why so few people do it. This is why most people prefer to live in the familiar prison of their conditioning rather than risk the chaos of genuine self-discovery. Because when you begin to examine the foundations of your identity, you realize how much of it was built on sand, how much of it was borrowed, how much of it was never yours to begin with. The process Jung described as individuation is not about becoming someone new. It is about becoming who you actually are beneath the accumulated layers of defense and pretense. But to reach that authentic core, you must be willing to lose everything you thought you were. You must be willing to see that your carefully constructed self-image is an illusion, that the virtues you pride yourself on may be compensations for hidden vices, that the person you present to the world is a negotiated compromise, not a genuine expression, that the life you are living may not reflect your true nature, but rather your deepest fears. Individuation demands that you confront the parts of yourself you have spent a lifetime avoiding, the anger you pretended you did not feel, the grief you never allowed yourself to process, the desires you labeled as unacceptable, the ambitions you suppressed because they seemed arrogant or unrealistic, the vulnerability you armored against because it felt like weakness. Each of these rejected aspects carries energy, and that energy does not disappear when you deny it. It becomes distorted. It leaks out in passive aggression, in unconscious sabotage, in the mysterious ways your life refuses to align with your stated intentions. You wonder why you cannot sustain relationships, why you cannot break through certain barriers, why you feel like you are fighting against yourself. The answer is that you are. The parts of you that you exiled are fighting for recognition. This is the beginning of real life, not when everything comes together, but when everything falls apart and you discover that beneath the rubble something remains. Something that was there before the conditioning. Something that will be there after the persona crumbles. Jung understood that every human being carries within them a potential that remains unrealized because it contradicts the image they have worked so hard to maintain. You contain capacities, desires, and truths that terrify the person you pretend to be. And as long as you remain loyal to that false self, those capacities will remain dormant. That potential will die with you. But there is another option. You can choose to stop performing. You can choose to stop apologizing for your existence. You can choose to stop contorting yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed to hold your full being. You can choose to find yourself. This does not mean abandoning all structure. It does not mean descending into chaos or selfishness. Integration, for Jung, was about bringing the unconscious into consciousness. It was about acknowledging the parts of yourself you have denied and incorporating them with honesty and responsibility. Not acting out every impulse, but recognizing that those impulses exist and that their existence reveals something true about who you are. Integration requires brutal honesty. It requires that you stop lying to yourself about who you are and what you want. It requires that you stop performing morality and start examining your actual motivations. It requires that you face the contradiction between what you say you value and what your behavior reveals you actually prioritize. This process is deeply uncomfortable because it strips away the illusions you have relied on to maintain your self-image. You discover that you are not as selfless as you claimed, that you are not as rational as you believed, that you are not as immune to the darker aspects of human nature as you pretended. You are forced to recognize that you are capable of pettiness, cruelty, cowardice, and dishonesty, not as theoretical possibilities, but as lived realities that have already manifested in your choices. But this recognition is not defeat. It is liberation. Because only when you acknowledge the full scope of what you are can you make conscious choices about who you will become. Only when you stop pretending to be pure can you develop real integrity. Only when you admit your capacity for darkness can you exercise genuine restraint. When you find yourself, you stop needing external validation to feel real. You stop measuring your worth by the opinions of people who do not know you. You stop performing for an audience that will never be satisfied. Because you have located the source of your existence within yourself, not in the reflections you receive from others. This is freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from falseness. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom from the exhausting pretense of being someone you are not. Life begins when you find yourself because only then are you actually present in your own existence. Only then are your choices genuinely yours. Only then can you experience the full weight and texture of being alive, rather than sleepwalking through a life designed by others. But the cost is high. You must be willing to disappoint people. You must be willing to lose relationships that were built on the false version of yourself. You must be willing to stand alone in the uncertainty of not knowing who you are while you figure it out. You must be willing to endure the discomfort of watching your carefully constructed identity dissolve. And most people are not willing to pay that price. So they live as echoes, as copies, as performers who forgot they were acting. Jung knew that the tragedy of human existence is not death. It is living your entire life as someone else. It is reaching the end and realizing you never actually showed up. You were there, but you were not present. You were occupied by voices that were not your own, driven by fears that belonged to someone else, chasing destinations you never wanted to reach. The question is not whether you will face this truth. The question is when, and whether you will face it in time to do something about it. Because life does not wait. It does not pause while you gather the courage to be yourself. It moves forward, indifferent to your hesitation. And every day you spend performing, adapting, and conforming is a day you do not get back. You cannot retrieve the years you spent living as an approximation of yourself. You cannot reclaim the moments you forfeited to fear and conditioning. But you can decide right now to stop forfeiting anymore. You can decide that the life you have remaining will be lived from the center of what you actually are, not from the edges of what others will tolerate. Finding yourself is not a destination. It is a return. Remembering. A recognition of what was always there beneath the conditioning, beneath the fear, beneath the endless negotiations with a world that demands you be smaller, quieter, and more palatable than you actually are. When you find yourself, you stop asking permission to exist. You stop apologizing for taking up space. You stop waiting for someone to grant you the right to live according to your own truth. You simply begin. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, irrevocable certainty of someone who has finally stopped running from themselves. This is what Jung meant. Life does not begin when you achieve or acquire or prove something to someone else. Life begins in the still, terrifying, irreversible moment when you decide to stop living as an approximation and start living as yourself. Everything else is preparation. Everything else is rehearsal. And the only question that remains is whether you will step onto the stage of your own existence before the curtain falls.